Hello and welcome to The Drum. I'm Peter Lloyd. Coming up tonight, Bob Brown's vision for Australia, including a global parliament, why all sides of politics are worried about a foreign buyout of Australian land, and what does the deadly Taliban attack on a hotel in Kabul mean for the war on terror. Our panel tonight, the former New South Wales Liberal leader Kerry Chikarovski, John Barron from ABC News Radio, and in Melbourne, the editor of the Drum website, Jonathan Green. Well, as the Greens are preparing for their numbers to grow in the Senate this week, their leader has given an idea of how the minor party plans to use its power. In a wide-ranging interview to the National Press Club, address to the National Press Club, Bob Brown has condemned the level of profits from mining companies heading overseas. He says the research commissioned by the Greens shows in the next 5 years, $50 billion will go straight into the coffers of foreign investors.
This mining industry, ladies and gentlemen, is largely foreign-owned. While Australia gets jobs, export income, royalties and company tax from our minerals, the foreign owners get profits, dividends, capital appreciation and influence. Most of Treasury's planned super profits tax is now due to end up in the deep, deep pockets of billionaires overseas in Switzerland, London, Calcutta and Beijing, rather than in Australian schools, hospitals and railways. Some $50 billion reaped from Australia's mineral resources will be sent overseas as dividends to foreign owners.
Well, the Minerals Council has accused the Greens of being xenophobic.
This is a pretty crude attempt to capitalise on the politics of xenophobia to essentially prosecute the Greens' real agenda, which is to introduce a tax on the industry that would tax it out of existence. Senator Brown has campaigned on closing down the coal industry and banning uranium mining. He's not about developing this industry and sharing the wealth for the benefit of all Australians. He's actually about closing it down, and that's what the real agenda is here.
Well, Senator Brown says he'll push for an expansion of the mining tax to cover gold and uranium, and the scrapping of the company tax cut for big business. The Prime Minister says there will be no changes. Kerry Chikarovski, you were nodding vigorously all through that.
Yeah, look, I think it's an interesting position for Bob Brown. I mean, I think that Bob Brown is very genuine. I think he's very committed. The question is, how political is he going to be? Because the issue that will face him, and this won't be just on the mining tax, it'll be on everything that he's going to do, is how hard he pushes. Because the problem he's got is that there is a hung parliament in the lower house, that the government is reliant on the goodwill of a number of independents. If Bob Brown pushes the government too hard on all of these issues, he may in fact force the independents to change their allegiance and either to hand government over to the coalition or indeed force the government to an election. Now, if there's an election, then Bob Brown may control the Senate, but he won't control the agenda. So he will have to make and the Greens collectively will have to make a very strong decision about, do we take what's a reasonable result or do we push too hard, and in doing so, by pushing too hard, force a change of government? Because I suspect that dealing with Tony Abbott and the coalition on some of these issues, they won't be even in a position anywhere near as amenable to what the Greens want as the Labor government is at the moment.
That's right. John Barron, there was almost a laundry list of agenda items from Bob Brown today. What do you think of the analysis of Kerry on this one?
Well, certainly there is a very strong argument that says while the river of gold is flowing, we should all get our hands full, and that we should potentially also not leave all that money for the current government or even the next government, and that we should be looking at some sort of a sovereign wealth fund, a future fund, so that, because as we know from history, these resources booms, they can continue for a decade or more. Maybe this will be an even longer double boom, but either way, we're going to want this money in 10, 15, 20 years from now. Bob Brown's point about the amount of money that is going offshore, a lot of it is, but more of it is staying onshore. More than 60% of the profits that BHP Billiton is turning is going into the pockets of shareholders in this country. A lot of people with superannuation funds that are very heavy in these sort of resources stocks. So a lot of it is staying here. Some of it that goes into the coffers of Xstrata in Switzerland, well, with the banking laws being what they are over there, we don't actually know. There's a lack of transparency as to exactly how much of this is going. But there's been a lot of toing and froing over these numbers today from this actuary in Tasmania that Bob Brown uses the basis for this analysis. But at the end of the day, everybody agrees there's a lot of money there, The miners can probably afford to pay a bit more, whether it's in royalties or in onshore profits. But how this all gets nutted out in the new political paradigm as of next week in Canberra, when the Greens take over the balance, is going to be interesting to see.
OK, we'll go to Melbourne next. Jonathan Green, your reaction to today's speech?
Well, the politics are interesting, and I think that the politics around the tax especially we saw a taste of last time round with the big campaign run by the miners, very much on this issue of we're Aussies, this is all for Australia, we're doing the right thing by the country. So it's clear there where Brown's going, and I think where the government probably is going to have to push their attack as well, is to sort of point to this reality. And yes, there are jobs in this country, there is an enormous wealth in this country generated, but we are by and large talking about foreign entities making those profits. So that's a canny political point to make. And on the issue of how far they sort of push their politics and how much they stand by their principles, I think that's the thing about the Greens as a party, that they will stand on their principle, and we saw the result of that with the Rudd CPRS, which failed due to sort of a Green position, which was way in excess of what the government would tolerate. So I think they're going to stick to their guns, and the situation as it stands means that those guns need to be taken with relative seriousness. Yeah, but I guess in a strange twist, one of the effects of this is we now see Abbott and the Prime Minister lining up together against the Greens. Well, one of the interesting things that Brown did say today as well was that if Abbott was to be Prime Minister in 2013 and was to attempt to repeal the carbon and/or mining tax, that the Greens would resist that in the Senate. And that's a political reality, which is an awkward thing for the opposition, with their stated desire to get rid of any carbon tax that may come in, because without that legislation passing through the Green-controlled upper house, of course, they could not do that. So it's tough politics.
Kerry? Well, I suppose that the only thing about that, though, is that if they then could find themselves subject to a double dissolution, if they and I would have thought of all issues...
Which is what Kevin should have done last year.
Well, but then, of course, we weren't going to have a carbon tax before the last election. Anyway, but I mean, I would have thought that's the kind of political judgment that Brown's going to have to make, which he's probably not had to do so much before. I mean, if they get to the stage where they push the government and the government does change, and then we do get a new coalition government, and the coalition government can't get its agenda through, I suspect you would find that on an issue such as a carbon tax, or indeed even perhaps a mining tax, that the government of the day would then go to a double dissolution to say we can't have the country held hostage by a minor party.
But we're in the new chartered territories of the Greens exercising some significant political power, and it won't just be this issue. There'll be others. Yeah. We'll now be hearing all about Bob Brown leveraging his influence in Canberra.
There's been some ill-concealed delight on the face of Bob Brown in the last week or so. He's clearly
relishing. He looks very happy, doesn't he?
He does, and you get the sense that this is the opportunity. This is the period in the history of the Greens Party, whether it's a long or a short history from here, and there's a question mark as to what happens after Bob Brown, certainly to the future of the party. But this is their opportunity, and so it's very much in their interest to make it work for the next 2 years, because they don't know what happens after that. And certainly if repeal becomes the Tony Abbott policy, or maybe a new form of rollback becomes the alternative policy here, the Greens aren't going to want to make the whole tent collapse in on itself. They're going to try and get the best deal that they can, and then the voters will have their opportunity in a couple of years to determine whether this is an arrangement they're comfortable with or not.
Which is why I suspected for the first time in their history, the Greens are actually going to have to seriously be thinking about the politics and not just the philosophy.
Well, this next point is probably a philosophy one, and that's Senator Brown also raising eyebrows in the press gallery by floating the idea of an international parliament in which Australia would play a role. The Greens leader says we're moving towards a global community, and although he admits his vision is conceptual and won't happen in his lifetime, it's worth talking about. Kerry, is this just pie in the sky or worth talking about?
Well, look, I mean, we have the European Parliament, we have, the concept of various in parts of the world coming together in different ways economically. I suppose, do we need to have a world parliament to discuss global issues? there may be some merit in the idea of having a forum beyond the United Nations in which you can discuss global issues. But I suppose I'm smiling because I think of the practicalities of this. I mean, how many people would there be in it to represent the world? If we've got 140 odd representing 20 million, how many? But the big
I don't remember you being this cynical when you were a politician.
but the question which really I sort of try to grapple with on this is where would it sit? I mean, which part of the world would you determine would be the centre of the Earth? You know, the centre of the universe.
It'll probably sit in Superman's Fortress of Solitude.
That's exactly right.
An ice cave or something. But the problem, of course, is that when people think of world parliaments and so on, they sort of think, oh, we can make Nelson Mandela president of the world. But of course, it ends up just being the Belgian transport minister, somebody very dull.
Are you trying to kill him?
I think this is greatly unfortunate, though, and I think yes, this is an interesting idea. I mean, it's a pity that we have, I think, a political and sort of commentary structure in this country which just tends to ridicule anything that's a little bit out to the edge like this. And ideas like this are worth our attention and are worth the discussing. I mean, it might sound a little far-fetched and loopy, but the fact of it is, if we get a bit sci-fi on the whole thing, that the problems that face us fundamentally are big global issues. And that big global mechanisms of some sort are going to have to be, have some role in the future in sort of settling some of these things. So it's good that someone has the stones to raise this in the sort of cut and thrust environment of Australian politics, where you just know that in saying that Bob Brown will be, ridiculed from here to breakfast. But, good on him for raising it.
God love him, but I mean, it was strange timing to come up with something that does look a little bit flaky on the eve of having a very practical political role to play.
Right. Maybe he's just appeasing the base.
The flaky base.
Yeah, he's got a lot to get off his chest. But I mean, when you go to the internet and do some research on the origins of the global parliament, it is largely a fairly strong intellectual response to globalisation, and there's some heavy hitters have been behind it, including Bill Clinton when he was president, the IMF and all the other bodies that scare the one world government crowd.
Some of the websites you do go to say that there is already a world parliament. George Soros funds it, and the Masons are involved as well.
That's right, the garage is under the ABC.
Yes, I saw it coming in.
Well, the conspiracy theorists used to always write to me and tell me that the Jesuits were running the world, so maybe it's going to have to be based in Rome.
But I mean, as you say, Jonathan, as you say,